Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today I have my first U.S. Presidential election forecast for 2024. Now, before I begin anything, I really want to put disclaimers here in the first few seconds of the video. I'm not entirely done tinkering with things. The polling is not settled since Kamala took over the race, which I'll get more into later, but any forecast right now is largely more for interest than meaning because nothing is set. Things are moving too much. It's not settled. And I'm also not super enthused by the polling, but I'll get into that more later. I think a lot of the stuff is a bit interesting, but we'll discuss that more later. But then, once more, before I properly begin, I would just like to thank all the channel members and thank you guys for helping contributing to the channel. And for everyone else who wants to support the channel, by all means, go down in the link in the description and join. Otherwise, like, share, subscribe, and do all your YouTube things. But with no further ado, let us begin. So, the U.S. presidential race here has been very chaotic in the last month. There was the debate between Trump and Biden in early June or late June, leading to Biden exiting the race, and then Kamala taking over. There was an assassination attempt on Trump. And VP picks have been had, J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, which have all caused a whole bunch of chaos and noise in the race. I'm not entirely certain where things will settle, and I don't think it is really valid to say things are settling. And as always, I have quite a low recency bias. And for what's the word for it? For the sake of clarity, if I put this to a really high recency bias, it is closer. I believe Michigan flips for Harris under very high recency bias, and it's a slight Harris popular vote lead, 47.8 to 47.6 for Trump. But I don't do high recency bias this far out. It is only August. I don't think the polls right now are very accurate. I don't think the polls right now are settled because of so much chaos has happened in the race. And I don't think they will settle until mid-September. And the way I have always done elections is I have very low recency bias that I increase closer and closer to election day. So right now, we're not at the we're at a higher recency bias than I have for Canadian election, or like the Canadian federal right now, but it's still quite low. So keep that in mind too. And you might say, oh, but then you're just trying to overstate Trump or something. No, this is something I do for everybody. If you don't like the result, don't like the result. And I would just like to be very clear here, because I know some people are probably going to comment on this, and they're probably not going to be happy with the result my model is showing. This is just what the model says with the data. You plug in the polls, you plug in historical data, and you run my algorithm, this is what I get. I don't adjust things. I don't tweak things. I spit it out. So if it's noise, it's nonsense, it's nonsense. If it's good, it's good. And I do that because you can't get better if you try to fudge the results. I'd rather be wrong than fudge the results into being right. Now, that said, I actually don't necessarily disagree with my model here. I think it's perfectly fine and reasonable that Trump is in this position. And the reason for that is a lot of the polls have been quite dubious. I don't want to bring up individual polls here because some of them are paywalled that I've paid for, and some of them are not. But the gist is a lot of the data in a lot of the data in the polls is dubious. Just as an example to bring up, again, I'm not going to bring it to the screen because of aforementioned paywall things, but we look at, say, white voters. And some of the last polls have had exceptionally close numbers for white voters. And that is not impossible, don't get me wrong, but it strikes me as suspicious. Like, to be clear, in the last, let's count this, the last 15 polls I've put in, not a single poll has had white vote anywhere close to its 2020 numbers. Now, that could be happening. Maybe there's a big shift happening. Maybe a lot of them are going to third parties or something. There is a couple third parties this time. You have Kennedy, the Libertarians, the Greens, Cornwall West or whatever. Cornell or whatever. But at the same token, this does strike me as quite weird. There was a 17-point lead for Trump in 2020, and a similar, I think it was like a 20-point lead in 2016, but now he's polling like 10-point lead, sometimes 13. Seems a bit suspicious. I'm not really sure I buy that. And then on the flip side, we have, say, the black vote, the other way around, where in 2020 the Democrats had a 75-point lead, and most of these polls are putting them only in like a lot of them are putting in like the mid 60s, 50 to 60 point lead. And again, it's not impossible that this shift has happened. I just don't really buy it. It doesn't seem reasonable that, say, the black vote has shifted this much Republican, but the white vote has shifted that much Democrat. That seems too much. Usually, demographics across the country will trend in the same direction. So if the Democrats are doing better with white voters, they'll do the same or better with black voters. If they're doing better with the South, they'll do the same and better in the Northeast. But again, what we have here, and this I will show you on screen. So we have my regionals. So this is the 2020 numbers. They had a 17-point lead Democrats in the Northeast, and now they have 7.6. That's what the polling is saying. That's not my numbers. That's what my model ran it, obviously, but the actual raw data, before I do any of my modeling math and all that stuff, the algorithm, has very similar results. I'll just, like the last couple, for example, the NPR PBS Marist poll, which was a very Harris-favored poll, only had 7-point lead in the Northeast for the Democrats. Survey USA only had a 5-point lead. Both publicly available polls. You can look at them if you want. So my 7.6 is within the noise of that kind of stuff. And actually, I'm slightly more favorable to the Democrats on average than the polling is. Yeah, my 7.6, which is a 10-point swing towards the Republicans, is favorable compared to the raw polling for the Democrats. But then we get the opposite, because this isn't just like the polls are overstating the Democrats or something like that. No, we have the opposite going on in lots of the South. In the South, we're looking at like nearly ties or like just 2 or 3 point margins for their 2 to 4 point margins for the Republicans. But they had almost a 4-point margin in 2020, and no poll, most of these polls are not polling a 4-point lead for Harris. They're polling usually 1 to 4, but we're seeing like 2 or 1 to 4 point leads in the South. So it should really be a lot closer than, like, the Republican lead should be a lot larger than it is in the polling based on the headline numbers. So that either tells us, again, we're having a big swing in the different regions of the country. Maybe the South is moving very different than the East or something like that. Or there's something wrong with the polling. I'm more inclined to believe at this time in the year of our Lord 2024, with how partisan and polarized the US is, that there isn't actually big swings happening, that the polling is just weird. And why would the polling be weird? It's not the polling companies. The polling companies are not trying to trick or mislead or lie to people. I genuinely think the polling is really weird right now because of how much chaos has happened in the race. The Biden debate was a disaster for the Democrats. The assassination attempt on Trump did a whole host of noise. Kamala coming in, replacing Biden is a whole host of noise. The two VPs and the conferences being, or the RNC and the DNC conventions happening, that's a lot of noise. It's going to do a lot of stuff. But most of those things probably won't stick. You're not likely going to see oh, a new leader is going to really stick for 4 months, 3 months. The assassination attempt is probably not even really notable news anymore. Biden resigning is old news now. The VPs are almost old news now. So a lot of this stuff is going to start settling, and I think we're going to start seeing the polls as a result of that settling. It's going to stop being weird. We're going to stop seeing this really strange discrepancy between the actual 2020 numbers and the polling right now. Because again, I don't think it's the pollsters who are wrong. I just think because of all the noise and all the stuff that has happened so dramatically in the last month or so, all of the polling is just kind of dubious. They're getting weird samples. They're getting weird responses. So where this settles, I don't really know. And I don't think anyone knows. And I think anyone who's saying they know is full of crap. Now, I'm giving you projection because that's what this channel does. I throw you a projection and I talk about it and what it means. But, you know, obviously take that with a grain of salt. I'm just a dude. And there's so much noise in this race, I don't even feel confident. But then I will just note, because there are people who think, Harris is destroying this, or it's a very clear lead for her, or whatever. No, it's not. Like, let's be serious here. Since Harris became the candidate July 21st to now, this is the Wikipedia polls. This is two-party ones. There's also three-way races and all that stuff. But it's pretty close in, like, who's winning the most polls. Sure, right now, Harris has a few more up in the most recent ones, but a lot of these aren't that close. Like, 1 point lead, 3. This one's 4, so it's not terrible. But Morning Consult in 2024 or 2020 had an 8-point lead for Biden. So, again, that's the other thing to keep in mind too, is that, and this is more well documented in places I've talked about many times in Canada, but polls do have a tendency to underestimate certain demographics, not on purpose, not maliciously, just a nature of sampling. And the biggest two groups that get missampled are very urban apartment dwellers and very rural people. Very rural people don't really answer the phone. I can't really tell you why, per se. Like, you can come up with reasons, I'm sure, but I couldn't, like, sit down and tell you this is why they don't answer the phone. I haven't really looked into it enough. All I can tell you is they don't answer the phone very much. They don't respond very nice to pollsters. Now, it could be they're busy, they're working, they're out in the field or something like that. I don't know. There's many reasons you could posit to it, but they don't answer the phone. And the other group is very urban apartment dwellers, and they are hard to poll because they move around too much. It's very common for people who live in apartments in big cities to move every 2, 3, 4 years. And if you move every 4 years, and a presidential election is every 4 years, you can move quite dramatically, and it can be quite hard to poll you. Now, on a presidential level, that might not be that big of an issue. For a congressional level, that can be a really big issue, or like a Canadian election where it's done by ridings. That can cause a lot of noise in those really deep urban ridings. Though the corollary to that is very deep urban ridings are very partisan for left-wing parties. So it's usually not that bad, especially in the US, where the Democrats will get like 80% of the vote in a lot of these ridings, or a lot of these cities. Like the New Yorks in the world, or like the Los Angeles. So, or like San Francisco's, etc. Like, so it's not as big of an issue in the US. If there's more left-wing parties, it can cause a lot more noise. But in the US, there's only one that matters. It's a lot less noisy. But the rural areas one is a big issue, and it does cause a lot of noise, and you can look at it like objectively time and again. The right wing in most countries overperforms polling, and this isn't because the polling is trying to underestimate the right. There's no malicious intent here. It's just these are the people who answer the polls, and if those people answer the polls, how are they supposed to know? They poll a rural area, they get their rural quota, but they only get the people who live in small towns and not people who live in very rural, like, farmsteads. Oops. You're going to get weird noise. We saw this quite aptly last year in 2023 in the Alberta election, if you've watched that, on my coverage on that. But essentially, the polls had a 20-point miss in rural Alberta. And when I say rural Alberta, I'm also including like relatively large cities like Lethbridge or Red Deer. They're like not huge cities. They're like 100, 200,000 people, something like that. But like relatively significant cities are included in this, but they still had a 20-point miss because a lot of these deep rural areas are like 90% conservative. When the US are like a 90% Republican. So if you get a weird sample from those areas, or they just don't respond to the poll and you're not really careful to make sure you get an accurate sample of them, you can get a really skewy poll. And that's, again, not necessarily malicious or bad polling. It's just that's how polling works. It can be very difficult to get it, and you have to actually acknowledge that this is a thing that matters. This is a consideration, a difficulty. So because of that, you usually see the Republicans overperform. There's a couple other reasons too. There's like shy Tory and stuff, but I think shy Tory is actually a lot less of a consideration in reality than just the sampling bias. The accidental sampling bias you see. And again, we saw this quite clearly in 2020. I'll just bring up the polls here so we can just see this, right? Like the actual result is Biden plus 4. Well, 4.5. And how many polls were actually there? TIP, IBD/TIP is there. USC Dorns, oh no, never mind. That's just the same poll. This Zogby poll is there. Rasmussen overestimated the Republicans, which is rare, but it happens. Or you could say they underestimated the Democrats equally. Let's see. This RMG one on the likely voter filter did it. Great. So like, there's some polls that hit it. Don't get me wrong, but not many. A lot of these polls, like again, this Ipsos Routers poll, it's off by 2.5 points. Research goes off by 3.5 points. The Economist YouGov is off by 5.5 points. So a lot of these polls can be quite wrong. And that's not because the polls are malicious. It's just because of how sampling works and how this misses happen. So you will see this miss matter more in certain states. It's going to matter more in the more rural states. But the other issue that you have is state polls are really notoriously hard to do. And I don't know why, but they're normally not very good. But it is what it is. Now, the other thing I want to discuss here, to go back to this, is if this is actually true, and we are experiencing like a massive shift in the East, well, the South is mostly going trend, because if, again, we're going from plus 4.5 to, well, D plus 4.5 to R plus 1.5, it's about a 6-point shift. This is about a 6-point shift. So the South is trend. That makes sense. The West is also trend. It's a little more than trend, but about trend. The Midwest is less than trend. Oh no, sorry, the Midwest is trend, sorry, yeah. But the East is significant. These are all approximately trend, and this is significantly changed. That's quite remarkable. We're talking about a 10-point change in the Northeast, whereas everything else seems to be trend, even with all the underlying poll weirdness. That means this part of the country, over here, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, up, is suddenly dramatically more competitive, but not in a useful way, by the way. Not at all in a useful way. I guess you could say Maine at large and New Hampshire flipping is useful for the Republicans, but New York, for example, is like 13-point lead. Let me try to pull up the data here because I don't have it queued up because I don't know why. Why would I want to have it queued up? Okay, here we go. I find that just makes it easier to visualize this. Yeah, so you have like a 13-point lead in New York, 2020, it was a 23-point lead. That's quite a significant change. And some of the polling before Biden dropped out was only having the Democrats up by single digits. Now, are the Democrats actually going to get single digits in New York? Probably not. But at the same token, that's pretty close. And we see this down to comparison state. Texas. Texas is about 11 points. New York's about 13. And what's interesting about that is you will see a lot of Democrat surrogates or talking heads on pundits or something like that, or sometimes some really bad Republican ones, saying, oh, Texas is going to be a blue state and then the Republicans are screwed. And like, yeah, don't get me wrong, if the Democrats can start winning Texas on this map, that's pretty big. That makes it really difficult for the Republicans to win. But nothing happens in a vacuum. The country isn't going to shift where like the Sun Belt goes blue and nothing else goes red. That doesn't happen. That's not how anything works. In a particular landslide election, maybe you could see that. But the average result is never going to be such that one party can never win. That's physically impossible. That's not how electoral politics works. Especially in the U.S. presidential race, where you have such a strong anti-incumbency on term 2, though right now we're in a very chaotic period with a bunch of one-term presidents, but term 2 in this, when you have a normal 8-year cycle, term 1, term 2, after term 2 is usually a very big anti-incumbency bias because the incumbent isn't running, so it's an open race. One of the things that makes it easier to win, again, is you are the incumbent. Obviously, incumbency matters. There's a reason why most senators or most congressmen are incumbent. It's very useful. So we're seeing possibly the inklings of a big shift in the US here. And it's something that I've been noticing for a while is I think you're going to start seeing, I think the trend in the Sun Belt is real for the most part. Maybe you could say like Georgia too. And it is trending blue slowly. But the North, Midwest, Northeast area is trending red as well. I think you're probably going to see eventually something like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. They're probably going to be relatively safe red. New York might be like a swing state. New Jersey might be like a swing state. But then like Arizona and Nevada will be relatively safe blue, and Texas might be a swing state. Or whatever. There might be some more. Georgia might be safe blue or something like that, right? Like, I think we're going to see that kind of trend. We're going to see the Republicans move this way and the Democrats move this way. And you could say all sorts of reasons why that might be, blah, 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 blah. One thing people always say is race. I don't know if race is actually the main causal factor of that. I actually think one of the big reasons why, say, like Texas or like Arizona are shifting blue is because they're having a large amount of people move to those states who, like, Arizona was a tiny state 40 years ago, right? Almost no one lived there relative to the population of the country. And now it's one of the largest states. Phoenix is one of the largest cities in the U.S. And how that happens is you have a whole bunch of people move into Arizona, not just Hispanics, not just, I don't know, insert immigrant community here, but also other Americans moving there. And one of the biggest trends I've seen as a election analyst, someone who does this professionally, is new growth cities are usually quite left-wing relative to the population at large. And I suspect the reason for that is when you have a huge influx of people to an area, they're rootless. They don't have families in that area because obviously their family was somewhere else. They moved here. They're often not tied down. They probably are just there, not really tied to the area yet. They're usually living in bigger cities because you don't move to Arizona to move to a tiny little town in rural Arizona. I can't even name one, but pick your favorite rural town in Arizona. They don't move to Arizona to move to that little town. They move to Arizona to move to Phoenix, to work in Phoenix. So they move to a big city, making the city bigger. They're a little rootless because they haven't obviously had a chance to set roots down yet. And that tends to make people more liberal. The constant influx of new people, regardless of whether they're foreigners or other Americans, also tends to make people a little more liberal because there's a bunch of strangers they don't know around them. And the more atomized a society is, generally the more liberal it is, because without strong social bonds, people are going to want more liberal policy because it replaces the lack of strong social bonds. That's a very common attributing factor to it. That's one of the reasons why big cities are so liberal. It's not because cities are liberal. It's because the nature of how people populate cities makes cities liberal, if that makes sense. So, like, if you had a big city that had almost zero new people coming into it for like 50 years, it'd probably be quite conservative, relatively speaking. But that doesn't happen because people move to cities. So the population of cities tends to grow over time. And actually, I think that's part of one of the reasons this phenomenon I just described here is one of the reasons why New York is shifting red. People are leaving New York City. It's shrinking. The population is declining in New York City. And people are moving into the upstate. Now, in the long term, if enough people move to the upstate, that might start shifting it back blue again because of the aforementioned thing. But in the short term, the lack of people moving into New York is going to de-liberalize New York. The longer New York's population is shrinking, the more right-wing it will grow. Because the people who stay in New York are the people who have the most roots, the most connections, the most properly built family connections, because they've had the time to build those, the most properly rooted community, because they've had the time to build those. New people to an area don't have that yet. Eventually they will, and once they have that, they'll start moving more right-wing. But until they have that, they won't be. And don't interpret this as me saying that if someone in a big city is fully rooted in, they're going to be as conservative as, say, a farmer in Wyoming. No, that's silly. But if you compare them to the city, the more community they have, the more rooted they are, the more conservative they will be for an urbanite. Maybe they won't vote for Trump, but they're probably not going to vote for a socialist. If that makes sense. And that's really the trend. I think possibly the explanation for a lot of the trends we're seeing. I think one of the reasons why the Rust Belt suddenly and sharply started moving to the right in the 2010s, part of it is economic policy. Part of it is discontent with the Democrats. But a lot of it is that the area is shrinking. No one's moving to the Rust Belt anymore. People are leaving the Rust Belt. And if people aren't moving into the Rust Belt and people are leaving the Rust Belt, the people who leave first are the least rooted. The people who leave last are the most rooted. And the more rooted you are into a community, the more conservative you are. The more stakes you have in your local city, your local town, the more likely you don't want it to change because that's the town you grew up and loved. That's why you stayed there. The more likely you are to move, the less you care about your current local jurisdiction, the more liberal you're going to be because it doesn't matter. The character doesn't matter, so you might as well try to do things. Change things if you want. you're not bothered by its current status. And I think that is a big reason why you see some things. One of the reasons I think possibly New Hampshire changed quite in the 21st century is a bunch of people started moving to New Hampshire. Is a bunch of people moved there. Now, you'll see some Republican surrogates will say like, aha, Arizona's becoming blue because Californians moved there. Or New Hampshire became blue because Massachusetts and Indians moved there. And like, yeah, sort of. But it doesn't really matter why. It just matters that they did. Really, the only exception to what I'm saying here is if you have like a exceptionally conservative sub-demographic move. For example, Florida became really red partially because just a whole heck of a lot of silent generation and boomer retirees moved there. Now, those boomer and silent generation retirees who moved to Florida were probably more liberal than the same group who live in Florida, who were born in Florida, raised in Florida, who have connections in Florida. But boomers and silent generation are so much more right-wing than the average American. For example, in 2020, the 50-plus demographic voted R plus 5, whereas it was, again, a D plus 4.5 election. So they're like nearly 10 points to the right of the average American. So even if moving around makes them a little more liberal than the average boomer, the fact that boomers are so much more conservative than the rest of America means that even a slight imbalance there means that the state's going to shift a lot more. And even among that, I suspect there was even more. It wasn't just a lot of retirees moving there, it was very particularly more conservative retirees moving there in particular because of how like COVID and all that stuff went down. And obviously, there's more factors than I just described. You can't describe and compare and understand all the demographics of a country, how every state votes based on one thing. There's many, many, many things. Some are more important than others. But I think this is one of the more important things to remember. And helps explain some of the big trends. States over here who are losing people becoming very Republican. States over here who are gaining lots of people becoming more liberal, more Democrat. Florida's really the only exception to this. Maybe you could say Illinois is a counter exception too, or another exception on the Democrat side, but it's harder to say with Illinois. Chicago just dominates the state so much. Like, Chicago is like 80% of the population of Illinois or something like that, or the Chicago metropolitan area. So it's kind of an interesting exception of a state, perhaps. Well, yeah, with that, I will bid you guys all adieu, and I will see you next week with something different.